Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the case of Joseph Sonnier and Mike Dixon. First I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Joseph Albert Sonnier was born on September 14, 1954, in South Dakota. In 1966, his family moved to Shreveport, Louisiana. 10 years later, he earned a bachelor's degree and went on to medical school. Joseph married a woman named Becky. The couple had two sons, one in 1980 and one in 1982. The family moved to Dallas, Texas, in order for Joseph to complete his residency. When he was done, he worked as a pathologist. In 2001, Becky left Joseph after having an affair with a man from Peru named Furman Gallegos. Eventually, she married her lover. In 2007, Joseph moved to Lubbock, Texas, which is 5 hours west of Dallas. He was normally considered to be a stern man, but Joseph became more relaxed and even took up ballroom dancing. He was very popular with women. As this was going on, his ex-wife Becky was not having the same level of romantic success. She told her husband Furman that she was leaving him. In response, he shot Becky twice in the chest with a pistol and called 911 to report the shooting. When the police arrived, they found Becky dead on the living room floor of her residence. On the couch, they found Furman mortally wounded by his own hand. The family dog, who Furman shot and killed, was next to him. In July 2011, Joseph became romantically involved with a woman named Rochelle Shatina after meeting at a dance class. The relationship became serious pretty quickly. Rochelle considered Joseph to be the love of her life. Prior to the relationship with Joseph, Rochelle had been romantically involved with another physician, a plastic surgeon in Amarillo, Texas, named Thomas Michael Dixon. He went by the name Mike. The couple met in February 2010 when Rochelle went to Mike for Botox injections. At this time, Mike was married. Mike and Rochelle had an affair, and Mike divorced. Not surprisingly, the romance between the couple was tumultuous. They separated, but Mike wanted Rochelle back. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On Wednesday, July 11, 2012, two landscapers arrived at Joseph's house in Lubbock, Texas. They did not have any reason to believe he was home. They were just there to perform work outside the house. While they were there, a woman who worked with Joseph came by looking for him. Joseph had not reported to work as expected, which caused concern. The two landscapers and the woman went around to the back of the house, where they noticed a window was broken. After seeing a spent case on the floor inside the house, they called 911. Here's what the police found during the course of their investigation. Joseph was dead on the garage floor. He had been shot 5 times with a .25 caliber pistol and stabbed 11 times with a screwdriver. A plastic Gatorade bottle with a hole in the bottom was found in the house. The police believe that the killer used this bottle like a silencer. It's never a good sign for community safety when a killer who shops for murder gear at 7-Eleven is on the loose. Nothing was missing from the house, even though many expensive items were in plain view. For example, Joseph had expensive artwork on the walls. Eventually, the police determined that Joseph had been killed on July 10, sometime between 7:15 p.m. and 10 p.m. This is the day before his body was discovered. Rochelle told the police about how Mike Dixon had been pursuing her romantically. This made Mike an obvious potential suspect. The police paid a visit to his house in Amarillo, Texas, 122 miles north of Lubbock. He denied any involvement in Joseph's murder and supplied the police with an alibi. They were able to confirm his alibi, and they did not believe that Mike was involved. Investigators pursued other leads. They had no idea who committed the murder. On July 15, 2012, 5 days after the murder, a man named Paul Reynolds contacted the police and told them that he was staying with a man named David Neal Shepard. David had been doing a lot of talking. He said that he killed Joseph at Mike's request. On the next day, July 16, the police arrested David and Mike. Neither one of them would talk to the police, but sometime later, David changed his mind. Here is the story that David supplied. He and Mike were friends. Mike was upset that Joseph was dating Rochelle and wanted to eliminate Joseph. he hired David to kill Joseph, paying him with 3 bars of silver worth $9,000. On July 10, 2012, at about 4 p.m., David traveled to Joseph's house and waited in the backyard. At about 7:30 p.m., he heard Joseph knocking on a window from inside the house. Joseph had spotted David in the backyard. David approached the house and shot Joseph through a window that Joseph had just opened. He then pushed a window in as Joseph ran to the garage. David found Joseph unresponsive in the garage and stabbed him to make sure he was dead. He drove to a lake where he disposed of the firearm. The police found the murder weapon in the lake, just like David said. In August of 2013, David entered a plea bargain. He pleaded no contest to murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In October 2014, Mike Dixon went to trial. David, of course, was expected to be the key witness against him, but things did not work out as planned. On the stand, David refused to answer questions and pretended he could not hear the prosecutor. When David did finally talk, he offered a new story. Here's what he said during his testimony. Mike hired David to disrupt the relationship between Joseph and Rochelle. It was not a murder-for-hire plot. Rather, David was simply supposed to collect evidence of Joseph being with other women. In theory, when Rochelle found out what Joseph was up to, she would break up with him for cheating on her. This would drive Rochelle back into the arms of Mike. On July 10, 2012, David ended up in a confrontation with Joseph. Things got out of hand, and David unintentionally discharged his firearm. After realizing that Joseph was dead, he stabbed him a couple of times. David could not explain why Joseph had 11 stab wounds. The jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, and the judge declared a mistrial. The state took the case to trial for a second time in October 2015. This time, they did not call David as a witness. Rather, they played the video recording of his confession to the police. On November 18, 2015, Mike Dixon was found guilty on 2 counts of capital murder. One count was for murder for remuneration, and the other count was for murder in the course of a burglary. Mike's sentence was a term of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mike appealed his conviction, citing numerous issues, including insufficient evidence to convict, cell phone information obtained without a warrant, and the exclusion of the public from the courtroom on 3 occasions. In December 2018, Mike's appeal was successful. His convictions were overturned. In January 2019, he was released on a $2 million bond. The state of Texas appealed the reversal, and in January 2020, they were successful. The appeal was reversed and Mike's convictions were reinstated. His bond was revoked, and he was returned to prison. In 2022, the appeals court determined that Mike Dixon could not have been guilty of 2 counts of murder for killing 1 person. The capital murder charge related to the murder in the course of a burglary was overturned. There was no cause for excitement on Mike's part, however, because his other conviction, the one based on murder for remuneration, was upheld. At the time I'm making this video, Mike continues to serve a life sentence. Now moving to my analysis. There is no question that David Shepard was guilty of murder. His story about unintentionally shooting Joseph during a confrontation is impossible to believe. If the shooting was accidental, why did David repeatedly stab Joseph afterward? The guilt of Mike Dixon, however, is more controversial. Mike maintains his innocence, and he has several supporters. They argue that there is no credible evidence that Mike was involved in Joseph's death. The state, of course, disagrees. They believe David's first story, which is Mike hired him to kill Joseph. This brings me to the question, was Mike guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. There is no question that David killed Joseph. He confessed to it, although he later claimed it was an accident. Mike and David started communicating at least 3 months before the murder. There were 37 text messages and 4 calls on the day Joseph was killed. Some of the messages indicated a sense of urgency. The day after the murder, there were 21 text messages. After the police visited Mike, he sent a message to David saying to stay calm and lay low. When the police asked Mike about Joseph during the visit, he initially denied knowing who he was. Mike gave David 3 silver bars, one of which David sold on the day after the murder. This makes it seem like David was paid to commit the murder. Mike claimed that he directed David to install cameras in Joseph's residence to catch Joseph with other women. Again, this was all part of his plan to win Rochelle back. This is different than planning a murder, but it is still a surprising and disturbing admission. It indicates that Mike was strongly motivated to reunite with Rochelle and would take drastic steps to accomplish his goal. If he was willing to have cameras installed, maybe he was willing to kill. After the murder, Mike jumped into a swimming pool with his cell phone. When this failed to destroy the data on the phone, he removed the SIM card. The police still managed to recover some of his messages because the phone had synced with his computer. The murder weapon, which the police recovered from a lake, was owned by Mike. Now moving to the exculpatory factors. Prior to the murder, David may have been stalking Joseph and Rochelle. For instance, one time when Rochelle was with Joseph in his house, she saw a flash in the backyard consistent with somebody using a camera. If David was really trying to take pictures, this supports the theory that Mike directed him to disrupt the relationship between Joseph and Rochelle. If the plan all along had been to kill Joseph, there would not have been a point to taking pictures. As far as Mike destroying the data on his cell phone, maybe he did this because he was embarrassed about having David spy on Joseph. The same motive could explain why Mike initially denied knowing who Joseph was. David had zero credibility as a witness. The only thing that is for certain is that David cannot be trusted. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Mike Dixon is guilty of murder? I believe he is guilty in reality, but I am not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. Here's how I look at this case. The murder could have been committed by David without Mike's involvement. David could have obtained Mike's gun without Mike knowing. It's also possible that Mike did know, but did not think that David was going to use the gun to commit murder. Without David's confession, there is no way Mike would have ever been convicted. David implicated Mike in one story, but tried to exonerate him in another. As far as I'm concerned, everything that David said should be discounted. This only leaves circumstantial evidence against Mike, and there isn't enough to prove that Mike was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Mike Dixon was self-centered, impulsive, obsessive, angry, manipulative, deceptive, cold, callous, vulnerable, insecure, jealous, had a sense of entitlement, and was exceedingly creepy. Mike became obsessed with Rochelle and was upset when they separated. He accused her of destroying his marriage and playing games with his emotions. In one message he wrote, quote, "Rochelle, I love you so very much that I sold my family down the river to have you," unquote. When Mike learned that Rochelle was seeing Joseph, he became jealous. Initially, Mike probably did not plan to murder Joseph. Rather, he planned to frame Joseph for cheating so that Rochelle would dump Joseph. He conspired with his friend David to accomplish this goal. David was described as an arrogant and obnoxious con artist who had many failed businesses. He had been a pharmaceutical salesman at one time, but he falsely claimed that he was a successful businessman, a sheriff's deputy, and a private investigator. David spent time at bars and at clothing-challenged clubs, where he acted like he was wealthy. He dressed in expensive clothing and smoked cigars. Mike and David did not seem like a good match to be friends, but they bonded over the topic of divorce. They had each divorced in 2010. It's not clear exactly what Mike and David did as far as trying to frame Joseph for cheating, but there were many mysterious incidents leading up to the murder. For example, as I mentioned, a person in Joseph's backyard took a picture using a flash. Someone stalked Rochelle at her gym, and a strange letter was mailed to Rochelle indicating that Joseph had used the services of a sex worker. It is reasonable to believe that Mike and David were behind these strange events. When these attempts to separate Joseph and Rochelle failed, Mike decided to use a more definitive method, namely homicide. He gave David a pistol and directed him to murder Joseph. Mike did not have a good understanding of mental health factors, or he would have realized that David was not stable. After the murder, David could not keep it together. He tried to bring harm to himself on 2 occasions and told his friend that he committed murder. This is what led to David's arrest Again, David's friend contacted the police. David implicated Mike, but later changed his mind because he wanted to deny his own responsibility in the murder. He could not claim the killing was an accident if Mike hired him, so absolving Mike was necessary. The problem was David's confession was more convincing than his denial. Those are my thoughts on the case of Joseph Sonnier and Mike Dixon. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.